This presentation is about editing spelling. To help put this together in a way that we can remember, there are three categories that we could classify for editing spelling. One has to do with plural forms, one has to do with possessive forms, and the other has to do with the way we treat the words in terms of emphasis. First, plural forms. Some of this is relatively elementary, but it helps to see some of the basics that perhaps we take for granted. For plural forms, of course, you add an S to the word unless they end in one of these other letters in which you would add ES. And of course, check for unusual Latin forms such as the singular of data being datum and the singular of alumni being alumni. Some of the alternate forms that are out there for various spellings, consult Merriam-Webster, and Chicago recommends taking their first variant. So for example, zeros can be spelled in two ways. Chicago would have you choose it the first way without the E. Check, of course, Merriam-Webster for any other tricky ways of creating a plural, but in other cases, think about what actually is plural. For example, one might earn a Bachelor's of Science in TechCom, but it's only it's not Bachelor of Sciences, because it's actually the first part that's plural, not the second. For the singular form used for plural, check for names ending in an unpronounced S or X, and Chicago recommends just leaving it as singular even if you mean plural. So for example, the two Dumas rather than the two Dumases. When a word is italicized, you add the S, but you keep the S in Roman. And if you're unfamiliar with that terminology, Roman is just normal treatment. It's not italics, it's not bold, it's just Roman style. You can see it there with the two Chicago Tribunes. For those items that are in quotation marks, you add the S as usual, but don't add apostrophes. To be continueds. For noun coinages, for example, ifs and buts, it recommends just to add the S as usual. And when you need to make a plural of letters, abbreviations, or numerals, simply add the S. 3 R's, URLs, 1990s. No apostrophe would be a main takeaway. Now for possessives. Obviously, for most nouns, if it's singular, just add an apostrophe and an S, and if it's plural, just an apostrophe, and when it's an irregular plural, such as children, you add the apostrophe and the S, children's. For proper nouns, abbreviations, and numbers, make the possessive as usual with the apostrophe S or just the apostrophe, depending on the word. For names that have unpronounced S's, make the possessive as usual, Descartes, Camus. For those nouns that are plural in the way that you spell them, but they actually just mean one thing, such as politics or economics, if you want to make it possessive, simply add the apostrophe. When things are owned jointly or separately, we have to take into consideration what to make possessive. So when the thing is possessed by both people or actors, only the second noun takes the possessive form. For example, my aunt and uncle's house, they both own the house in this case, therefore only uncle's takes the possessive form. However, when the things are owned separately or discretely, both nouns take possessive form. For example, Dylan's and Jagger's hairlines. Obviously, two separate heads, two separate hairlines. This one's a little bit trickier because it's a common mistake because we don't really consider it possessive, but it actually is. Made possessive with the apostrophe in 3 days' time. So some people will leave off the apostrophe, but it's needed, and the way to remember is to think in terms of 3 days of time. When the thing possessed is implied, it needs the possessive form. A friend of Dick's. Think a friend of his. Remember, a gerund is a noun, is a verb taking the form of a noun or the function of a noun. So when the gerund is the subject of the sentence, it takes the possessive. For example, fathers assuming the care of children is more common today. It would be a common mistake to not include that apostrophe after fathers. With italicized or quoted terms, the keep the plural as usual. The apostrophe and S should be in Roman, however. Now for emphasis, which we may not think of as spelling, but spelling is essentially the treatment of words. Italics, of course, for general emphasis, but Chicago recommends that you don't try to use this unless if you can find another way to communicate emphasis. But if you have to, it was Leo. Generally, Chicago and most professional writing recommends using italics rather than boldface or underscore, otherwise known as underlining, when you want to communicate emphasis. So prefer the italics to those. For unfamiliar words or phrases from other languages, use the italics, but you generally have to do so only the first time in a document. And for words from other languages that are relatively familiar and have come to common use, or they're listed in Merriam-Webster as just Roman and not italics, Chicago recommends just setting it in Roman. Pasha, in vitro, a priori, bourgeois. These are indeed from other languages, but you would need to just keep it Roman because they're so common. For Latin words and abbreviations, if they're common, again, just keep them in Roman. For example, ibid or et al. For key terms in a document, you can set them in italics or boldface, but of course be consistent, but you generally only need to do so the first time. Square quotes are when you when you see people communicating together, somebody uses their two fingers in both hands and they kind of make mock quotations. You generally understand that they're being ironic or they're being using slang or whatever. Chicago recommends that you use them very sparingly and only in certain contexts. For common expressions or figures of speech, you don't need to put them in italics or quotation marks. For example, I grew up in a one-horse town. Relatively common, but of course a lot of this is based on context. For signs and notices, for example, if you're writing a sentence and in the sentence you need to literally state the sign, the name of the sign or what's on a sign or notice, you can use the basic rules of capitalization, specifically headline style, but if they're longer sign names or notices, treat them in quotations. But the point is not in italics. Same thing for mottos. When a word or phrase is used as a word or phrase, it should be italicized or enclosed in quotation marks. For example, what is meant by neurobiotics? When you want to use letters as letters, that means you literally are talking about the letter itself in the sentence. You can keep them italicized except for when they're common expressions. So an example of a common expression is dotting the I's and crossing the T's. But if you want to talk about the letter A in a sentence, like I just did, I would need to have italicized that letter A. For keyboard combinations and shortcuts, remember that you would need to use one of the plus or minus signs without any spaces, and it depends on the operating system. So a plus sign for Windows and a minus sign for Apple. And that's editing spelling. Relatively straightforward, but indeed that chapter is a bit long, so I recommend you consult the lecture slides for this as a sort of cheat sheet to consult when you need to think about spelling.